Hey, thank you all so much for joining another episode of Celeste, the Therapist Podcast. My name is Celeste. I'm a therapist from Boston. I'm going to have my special guest introduce herself to you all.
Hi, Celeste. Thanks so much for having me. I am Madeline Popelka. I am a writer, a trauma survivor, a mental health advocate, and the creator of Healing from PTSD on Instagram, Twitter, social media, everywhere. And on that platform, I share about my experiences of healing from trauma, and I've curated a community of trauma survivors. And I am also the author of You're Going to Be Okay, 16 Lessons on Healing After Trauma, which was just
Yay.
released.
We both got the book.
It said, yeah, it was just released in September. So it's so exciting to finally see it out in the world after working on it behind the scenes for, several years.
Wow. Okay. So that's good. I'm going to get to how you got to the book because I'm sure I got a lot of listeners who may have toyed with becoming an author or has been struggling around that. But I'm grateful for you. I've read your book. Thank you. I got a signed copy. I feel so special. You're going to be okay. And the whole purpose actually behind this podcast is to let people know they're going to be okay. And so I found Madeline on Twitter. And a lot of the things she says are a lot of the things that I say. And I kind of want to start a little bit from the beginning about where did you come from and what was your upbringing like to help people get a sense of who you are?
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in the Bay Area, and I grew up in a household with a mother who is a refugee from Vietnam. And then my dad is a white guy from the Midwest. So I am mixed and grew up in a multicultural household,
Mhm.
which, as a lot of other mixed people may be able to relate to, it can bring up you know, a lot of confusion,
Yeah.
not knowing where you fit into the world. So I feel like I struggled like with not knowing who I was
Mhm.
throughout my entire life. And then, my mom has, an incredibly traumatic past, living like not just how she was brought up in Vietnam, where corporal punishment was the norm,
Yeah.
but also living through the devastation of war and the aftermath and escaping her country and coming to America as a refugee. Um, and the way that her parents parented her, which, they 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 were very physical, and
Mhm.
she endured physical pain daily. Um, while she did not harm me physically, she would threaten to do so.
Mhm.
And this instilled a fear in me. And when she'd chase me around the house, threatening to beat me, um, it made me feel like there was something wrong with me.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, why is she treating me this way? Like, I am a bad person. So at a very young age, around 7 years old, I started to hold this belief that I am damaged or a bad kid because I'm being treated this way. And I struggled with my mental health throughout my life, as many other survivors of childhood trauma do.
Yeah.
And, I kind of just, like, ignored what happened because I didn't really understand what was going on with me.
Makes a lot of sense. I
Yeah.
And I wanna, go back. So, as you hear Madeline share, I just want the audience to be clear, when she was 7, she wasn't, articulating all of these things. This is
No,
after
no,
much
no.
this is after much work. She can go back and actually, like, go through her timeline and kinda see where things took a turn for her. One thing about, parents, because sometimes when we get the awakening, it's kinda like, "But they're our mom or they're our dad, but they're also human." And I know like you've gone back and was like, whoa, she came from a refugee camp, and you look at all of the things that she's done or that she's gone through. It sounds like she wanted to do it different, but she probably didn't have the tools to provide you with a safe space, even though she probably thought she was being safe because she didn't actually hit you. But the verbal stuff, I'm sure, took a huge toll on you. What are your thoughts about that when it comes to your mom and the way that things went down for you?
Yeah, I've always, knowing my mom's past and, where she came from, I have always had compassion for my mom for that
Mhm.
reason. And thr as I was working on this book, and when I got the publisher and I was like, okay, this is going to be out in the world, it's happening, and I am planning to share this part of my
Story.
story, I had to have a conversation with her about it. And at first, it was just going to be informing her that, I'm writing about this. I need to like share my truth. And it opened up a conversation about that where, I said, you did these things that harmed me. And I know that even though it wasn't physical, it still um, had a huge impact on me, and she was very understanding and said,
Wow.
yeah, and she was like, I didn't know better. I was just, this is how I was brought up, and I knew that like hitting um was not the, quote
Oh,
unquote right way to
right,
parent.
right,
So she was trying to make changes and was trying to, break these cycles, but did not have all the knowledge and tools
right,
as I think back then many parents have had as
right.
well. And so she acknowledges
Okay.
where she could have done better, which was, a surprise for me and ultimately incredibly healing as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you had that experience. Just for clarity for people too, that was healing for you, and your mom was willing to like listen and
Right.
say what happened. In some cases, this is for my audience, that it may not go down that way. And it doesn't mean
Absolutely.
that healing can't happen if the other party doesn't acknowledge what happened. And I think as a trauma survivor myself, like knowing how it eats at you over the years. And then you begin to kind of get it muddled a little bit. Not having that validation sometimes can be hard from the person, right? What are your thoughts about that?
For sure. No, absolutely. I think that this was, the path for me and, part of my journey. And to be completely honest, I don't think that I would have ever had that conversation with my mom if I didn't have this
Mhm.
book where I was like, I'm going to be talking about this. So I need to let her know. That really forced me um, to start to make a plan around how I was going to talk to her about this. And it wasn't just like I woke up one day and was like, okay, I'm going to talk to my
Right.
mom
Oh,
about
no.
this. Oh, no, it was like, I felt like it was like several weeks of therapy,
Yeah.
doing a lot of work with my therapist to be like, okay, what's the game plan? How am I going to take care of myself if this doesn't go well?
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Okay, that makes sense. Another thing I wanted to mention, Madeline talks about at 7 years old feeling damaged. Not, I mean, part of it is like the trauma of the things that were going on, and then just not knowing who she was, being Asian American, growing up in a household where probably, I mean, things were not, you were not talked to, maybe more talked at, and things like that. For parents, I think that, and I'm a parent, and when I talk to my therapist, like in all parts of life, I feel like I do really well. But when it comes to being a parent, I have more anxiety because I understand the way which kids take things. There's this doctor I follow, Dr. Gabriel Mate. He talks about kids being narcissists, meaning that we do think everything is about us, but why wouldn't we? Because we don't have language to or knowledge to understand why it's going on. Like, let's say like dad comes home angry and then nobody's talking to us, and it could be about work, but we could think it's about us because there's no conversation. And a lot of times people really don't know how to communicate. So for kids, they're trying to make sense of the world by just the information that they're given, which is why, like at 7, you kind of got this sense of like, oh my gosh. And growing up in that high intensity caused Madeline to be more like try to perform as well as possible. Is that pretty accurate? Like trying, like, and that works for us. You know, I tell people the coping skills we come up with as a child can work for survival. But at some point when responsibilities comes, other relationships comes, it gets harder and harder. What are your thoughts on when you look back at trying to like make everything okay, not have people angry? Like that means I need to perform well. Tell people about that part.
For sure. I tried to earn my mom's love, and one thing that, she was heavily focused on was academics. And I mean, she even said, and I wrote this in the book, if it's not an A, it's an F. And so I like her standards were very high. Um, and I and even when I did my best and I could not achieve, A's across the board, I mean, I never did. My sister was able to, and I always had, she was older than me, so I was always compared to her as well. Um, I tried to, and then I was just never able to meet my mom's expectations, which I adopted myself as well. And
Mhm.
it just left me with a feeling like I am not doing enough. And whatever, no matter how hard I try, it's not going to be enough.
Yeah. And I thank you for sharing that. And I think that having that mentality going into adulthood gets even more challenging because like your other people will be like your mom, like your partner or work or the client that you're working with. But until you do like trauma work and what that looks like for everybody is different, it's hard to make the connections because the brain is only going off of the experiences it's had. And so all of your experiences, is it fair to say created this like false sense of self and also this like fear that like I'm not doing well. Does that feel accurate?
For sure. And I mean, that is something that I'm still working on
Yeah.
because when you live your life like that for, decades,
Yeah.
like I didn't start doing my healing work until I was in my late 20s. So up until that point, I felt like I did hold this, this this image of myself which was less than what I truly am. And, going through healing work,
Yeah.
I feel like I'm able to see myself more clearly and see
Yes.
my worth. And yeah,
One of the things that you talk about in the book, and every chapter is very thoughtful. But your emotions are your allies. That's chapter 3. That's the name of the chapter. Your emotions are your allies. I mean, we say that now. Like you and I, we've done work, so we can say
yeah.
that. What was it like as an adult to be riddled with so many emotions that you weren't able to name, that feels like it was taking over? Because as I'm reading the book, I feel like I'm there with you running, I'm there with you, like in all these situations that just didn't make sense for you at the moment. Going back, I know you can understand it better, but what was it like to have all of those emotions but no name, not understanding what's going on with you?
Yeah, it's scary
Yeah.
because you're like, "What is happening? I don't understand." Like, I'm feeling all these things, but I don't like and it's not just, in your head, it's also very like physical as well. Like, you know, we feel our emotions like in our stomach and in our
Mhm.
chest. And so it's scary when it feels like when you lack the awareness and it just feels like everything is coming out of nowhere, because you're like, "What is going on? Am
Yeah.
I crazy?"
Yeah.
Um, so once I was able to start to, you know, build some self-awareness and identify my emotions and, start to, you know, link things back to, my feel like, you know, creating the links between my experiences and my feelings and my thoughts, then it became less scary just
Yeah.
knowing where it's coming from.
Yeah, that it's powerful and leaning into it. I had a therapist on, she talked about like don't shame yourself from trying to avoid pain. And I know
Yeah.
there's different ways that some society doesn't accept, there's so many different ways that we've tried to avoid pain. And so it's important not to shame yourself, but also understanding like when you are ready to do the work that, it is a powerful experience to have a name for what you're going through. Because the fear and the emotions, and when Madeline talks about it being in your body, growing up, I would have back pain, and it wasn't until I became an adult I realized like that's where my emotions get stored, and it's not something that society or the medical model talks about here. They never asked me if there was anything going on. With my clients, I'm always checking in when there's a physical ailment about the stresses that are happening because they're so related, they're so connected. It's something that uh, it should be like I say we should know this like our ABCs. There's no reason why we have to go
If
through so much
only.
pain.
If only it was taught in, like,
I know.
when we were young, if we were armed with this knowledge when we were growing up, oh my goodness, how
Yeah.
different things would be.
Oh my gosh, and I think that, as Madeline and I talk about the work that she's done because she lays it out. She goes back and forth in her book, and talks about different points in her life. But as we lay it out and as we get to this understanding, like I always say, like after 18 is kind of our responsibility. It's really hard to get to a place of healing when we don't take ownership of our life. And I think I mean, tell me your thoughts about this as somebody that's done extensive work. Because for me, when I was starting to get to that place and taking ownership, it's like, but it wasn't my fault. Like that was like the thing that I kept holding on to. And once I released it, um, and changed my perspective about what owning my power looked like, it made the journey a little bit easier. But I'm curious about as you started doing it, like how did that work for you as far as like fault and responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it like, when all of my PTSD symptoms came up in full force and I was suffering, you know, from nightmares, panic attacks, severe anxiety, insomnia, like, I was just so desperate to find relief that that was my motivation to heal because
Mm.
it was not sustainable for me to keep living like that in like in constant fear, you know, in this state of just being like so on edge. It was
Mhm.
exhausting and I just could not go on. So that's what for me, that's what personally drove like that. I was just like, I have no option but to heal because I could not continue living in that state. I just had to get better.
That makes a lot of sense. And and for me, when I decided to go into therapy, like not as a therapist, but as a client, like do work, it's like I got tired of being tired, and I felt like it was like a low point where I got to that place. And what does when you think about like the idea of taking ownership, because you have a really great community. The reason why your community is so powerful is because you speak our language, right? You speak and I speak the language because I remember the things that were not helpful for me. I remember the things that I've struggled with. And so I'm a very transparent person, even as a therapist and as a speaker. I'm very transparent, and it's helpful to have someone that understands. I say AA works, Alcoholic Anonymous works, because when you have someone that like is speaking your language, has been sober for 20 years and talks, it's like, oh, you get it. You understand the different cycles that come along with it. But what has taken your power back felt like for you? Because it's a lot of reframing that you had to do in your mind.
Oh my gosh, it was just like one step at a time, honestly. And I couldn't, like, when I was suffering from all these PTSD symptoms, I did feel powerless.
Mhm,
So, like, the process of taking my power back was number one, like minimizing my symptoms and like
mhm,
becoming like getting to a more like regulated state.
mhm,
But then on the other side of that, for me, building my community and then advocating for other trauma survivors is really what I think helped me felt the most empowered, especially as someone who has, in the past, I've had a hard time advocating for myself.
right.
In a way, it can be easier to advocate for others like you, and
Mhm.
that is empowering too.
That's awesome. There's all of these like cool quotes. I'm gonna put one up for people that are watching. Changing the way we relate to our pain changes the way we live with it. Um, One of the things I think that is a powerful thing to remember is that pain is a part of life. And so even as we're talking about healing, there are moments that, Madeline and I can attest to, that the pain feels like, oh my gosh, it's not going anywhere, or it feels really hard. It's not that life gets perfect um, for
Right.
you as you're going on this journey, but the way we relate to pain looks different. Does that sound accurate? What I'm saying?
Yeah. So I when I think about that quote, it's like when when I am going through a hard time and there is pain in my life, um, a lot of times I will judge myself or try to talk like be like, "Oh, why am I still feeling like this? Like, why
Mhm,
can't I get over this?" Like I would talk to myself with like a lot of judgment and criticism.
mhm.
But when we meet ourselves with compassion
Yeah.
and understanding, and we're there to sort of comfort ourselves instead of attacking or criticizing
Yes.
ourselves, yes, it makes the pain so much easier to live with. Like, yes, it's still there, but if you're giving yourself like a warm hug instead
Yes.
of, being cold to
Yeah.
yourself, then it makes it easier to live with.
Oh my goodness, absolutely, because we're with I say this all the time. You're with yourself 24/7. Do you want to be with a bully or somebody that has compassion? And the compassion
Yes.
feels better, and it's great for your inner child, and being able to meet those needs as an adult now that we are able to and engage with our thoughts is powerful. And I think that the more grace you can give yourself, for people that are listening, the journey looks a little different. Um,
Mhm.
but speaking of the journey, there's this last quote, and then I want to get into like the process of the book. There's so many, like I can like flip the page, and I just pinpoint it too, but I can just flip the page and everything is like, oh my God, this is so good. This is so good. Like everything is so good.
Thank you.
Because I like to read a lot of mental like books like this, like self-help books. Because it helps me with language too as I'm talking to people, and it's a reminder from me. Like it helps me because just for clarity, like I've done a lot of work, but I feel like this is my medicine, the book and listening to things, right? This other quote that she has in here, it says, there's an endless number of paths you can take to heal, and no single way is the right way. And she puts that in quotation marks. I think that's important. I started this podcast because I used to go live on Periscope. They're no longer here, but there was Periscope. And as a therapist, talk because I'm just like passionate. I'm like, I went through healing. So I'm like, everybody's gonna get this healing. I need to tell the people. And then people would tell me, like, oh, but you're a therapist. And so like as if like I don't like I'm different because I'm a therapist. So that's why I was like, I'm gonna start this podcast and bring other people on that are not therapists. So you can see that it's not a therapy thing. And also growing up in America, I feel like a lot of times healing is attached to money, insurance, psychiatry, and therapy.
Mm.
And so like if that's the mindset that I have around my healing and I don't have access to that, like that feels hard. I think that would feel hard. I think it's really important. And you do such a great job at this. Like, even as you're sharing, like, we know this is your book, we know this is your journey, but you make it clear over and over again. This is what worked for me. Like, I don't know what yours look like, but you do give like different ways. Why is that important to let people know there are endless numbers of paths that they can take on this journey?
Yeah, I mean, trauma is deeply personal, and so is healing. Like, we are all unique people. We all have different backgrounds, and we all have different preferences, and there will never be a one size fits all for everyone. And um, I think that's in going back to what you were saying about how in America, like healing is like so attached to therapy and, you know, having insurance to get that therapy and all of that. And the reality is that therapy isn't accessible to everyone. And while it is an incredible resource, even I know many trauma survivors who have tried so many different types of therapy and they
Mhm.
feel like they're stuck because they're like, okay, this is the only way I can heal and this isn't
Right.
working for me. So there's no hope. So,
Right.
I always like to remind people that, you know, there is not just one way to heal. If therapy isn't accessible to you or if it isn't working for you at this time of your journey, you don't need to force it. There are so
Mhm.
many other paths you can take. I mean, if one on one therapy isn't for you, maybe a support group or like peer support would be beneficial.
Yes.
Connecting with community and people who can relate to your pain and like having that empathy can be so powerful as well.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of like so much of healing is working through the pain, but I think a lot of people forget or aren't aware that healing is just as much about holding space for your joy and creating space to feel good and have fun because we were not I mean, we're not here just to, be in pain and suffer
Mhm.
all day,
Mhm.
every day. We need to even if we are doing the hard healing work, we need to create space for the things that bring us joy to make that journey more endurable because it isn't sustainable just to be doing the hard stuff all the time.
100%. And I love you said create the pain. I mean, create the joy. Because you're not gonna find it. It's something you have to create, especially if you haven't been exposed to it. And also, you know, you said this earlier, but I just kind of wanna reiterate, like, we were not meant to live in fear. And you know, as I all my readings and like I listen to things, it talks about like we're the only species that can activate our amygdala with our thoughts, the part that the fight or flight. And so because unfortunately we're not really taught how to be mindful and engaged with our thoughts only go by our experiences. And so many people are living in like this heightened sense of lack of security. And for valid reasons, right? Because if you haven't dealt with your past, then your system is trying to protect you. So it's keeping you on alert. It's essentially what it's doing, all of the struggles. And Madeline talked about different traumatic experiences and what led her up in when her 20s when she finally um, decided to like seek support, and she's done that in different ways. But her system was honestly trying to protect you because that's all it knew was to live in fear. Is that something that you've kind of come to terms with as you're thinking about it?
Absolutely. And for listeners who haven't read the book, I am someone who's gone through, there was my childhood, but after that experience, there were several other traumatic experiences that I went through. None of them were like incredibly intense, but they still added to the pain. They
Yeah.
added to the fear.
Hmm.
And over time, these fears kept on building and building. And I mean, I wasn't aware of it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah, the fear just kept on building, and I was living, and without knowing it, like my fear was really in the driver's seat in my
Yes.
life, and I
Yes.
was making my decisions based on all these fears that have accumulated throughout my life. And then, it was like it all blew up and it was like,
Yeah.
panic attacks and everything. And then my body was like, you know
Yeah.
what, no more. You need to bring attention to this. And that's when I um, finally went to therapy.
And I tell people that we don't know what our bandwidth is with our mind. I say a lot of times we play Russian
Mm,
roulette, not intentionally, but we do with the way that we operate. And if we seen what we did in real time to our body by ignoring our pain, we wouldn't do it. The same way if we had a scab and it got bigger or it's bleeding, we wouldn't say we don't have time to put a band-aid on, or we wouldn't just drip blood around the like walking around. Like we actually make time to deal with the physical wound, but the emotional wounds operate the same way. They spread, and they spread in different parts of our lives. And the biggest part, I think, is the way that we think about ourselves and our lives, and that can be so
mm,
debilitating for so many different reasons. The last quote I want to say is that, like, for Madeline, not for me. Your trauma didn't make you stronger. How you handled it did. And there's this
mm,
misconception of what strong is. And for me, like, if I was crying, my mom would be like, "What are you crying for?" And I'm like, "I don't know." And so I was like shamed and guilted for crying. And so I was like, I gotta be strong. Like I can't cry. I just gotta keep going.
mm.
And now my mindset around strong is like being able to be vulnerable, being able to
Yes.
understand what's going on, because not dealing with the things I struggle with, it just shows up when I least expect it. And that
Yes.
doesn't feel strong at all. Like, so for people listening, if you struggle with vulnerability or struggling with like dealing with that inner stuff, know that actually like dealing with it is actually you being strong. And that is the part that makes you strong, is like the way you handle it. Does that sound accurate?
Absolutely. I 100% agree. Yeah. And yeah, just that that's exactly 100%.
Okay.
I won't say anymore. I won't say
We have
anymore.
a lot of synergy, me and Madeline. So like
Yeah, we
she speaks
do.
my language, I speak her language. And so as I'm reading this, I'm like, oh my God, this is so good. Speaking of this book, this amazing book, You're Going to Be Okay. And I know this had to be therapeutic to do this, but also scary because you're like, I go through these phases. Some like I love what I do. I know this is my purpose, but I'll be like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe like I'm doing all this and I'm sharing all this. Like I go up and down at times. So when was the aha moment? Was like, I'm gonna write this book, and what was that process like for you?
Yeah, so when I was struggling with PTSD, like like pretty recently after I was diagnosed, and I was just like, I need to feel better. As a reader, I turned to self-help books and
Mhm,
psychology books, um, to because I was like, I need to feel better. I'll
mhm,
do whatever it takes.
mhm.
And as I was reading a lot of the trauma books out there, they were, they have so much great information in them about, psychology and the symptoms and why we have the symptoms. But as well, number one, some of them were very triggering to read, talking
Yes.
about really intense traumatic experiences, which I
Yeah.
mean, The Body Keeps the Score is like
Very
a great
intense.
resource, but very intense. And as a trauma survivor reading it, like I don't need to have a panic attack. Like when I'm,
Right,
like
right,
I
right.
don't need to read anything super triggering. Um, and then and then at the same time, again, as someone who has been through these, quote unquote, smaller traumatic experiences that weren't that bad, a lot of what was in these books, they were talking about, war, combat, like really, really
Intense.
intense traumatic experiences, and I didn't feel seen. I would compare
Mm,
my experiences to theirs, and I didn't feel validated. So after a while of like doing healing work, and once I got to a place where I minimized my symptoms, and I my self-esteem was starting to build. I was like, you know what, I have an idea for a book, because this something that is more comforting and encouraging for trauma survivors needs to exist. So I set out to write the book that I
wow.
needed to read when I was healing, like something that felt like a warm hug, something that gave like told you that you aren't broken, you aren't crazy, you aren't
Yeah.
damaged, and that there is hope and that healing is possible.
I love it, and you're so right. Madeline, a few years ago, I was starting a book club, and it was like adult children of emotionally immature parents, and I was like, oh my god, this is so good because I'm reading it from two lenses, right? Somebody that like grew up with trauma, but as a therapist, so I'm like a geek with this psychology stuff. And then I remember somebody said, I had to like this is not something you can rush through. Like this is heavy stuff. And it dawned on me like my when I'm some of the stuff that I've read or recommended, um, I didn't realize like how heavy it felt, especially if you're in the beginning stages of trying to work through things. Like it's a hard and it's a hard thing to read, which is why when I read your book, I'm like, it's such an easy read. It's easy to
Yeah.
follow along. It doesn't feel triggering. And it's not like fluff. It's not like she's looking at things with glassy, rosy glasses, but it's very balanced in a way where, regardless of where you are on your healing journey, that it will be okay to read. So
Yes.
what you were trying to do really was able to happen with the way you put that together.
Aw, thank you so much. I'm really glad to hear that you felt it, reading
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was good. And then did you go back and forth on, like, publishing, like, if you wanted to publish it or not? Or did you have a straight streamline of like, "Nope, I'm gonna do this."
I was like, this book needs to exist. And I ended up going the traditional publishing route. But and I mean, that is the publishing industry is tough.
Mhm.
So I wasn't getting my hopes up. I was going to self-publish that book if I couldn't get a publisher on board.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so either way, I was like, this book is going to exist whether a publisher is behind it or not.
What kept you motivated to, like, keep going with this process of the book? Just for people that may have an idea, 'cause there's so many ways you can self-publish, so, like, but just in regards to, like, putting it together, because you had to put it together for it to be out in the world. What kept you
Yes.
motivated to do that?
I had my healing from PTSD community, and I'd get so many questions from people asking me things, and I was
Oh,
like, I cannot take, I just need to put a resource together, because I don't have the time to respond to
that makes
everyone's
sense.
DMs and, do all of this. So that's really what kept me going, was like, I want to have this resource that that people will be able to access. Um,
Okay,
so,
that makes
so yeah,
sense.
yeah,
So for people that are, whether it's a book or something else, it sounds like for Madeline, community was what kept you going, because you do have a community, because sometimes if we're just doing this on our own in isolation, we can go back and forth, not just this book, but in general for people that may have an idea that they want to do, find that community, and the community looks different. In this book also, Madeline gives a ton of resources for different things. When she talks about things, there's resources all in the book. So really good read. Where can people find this book? You're going to be okay. Oh, it says 16 lessons on healing after trauma. I
Yes.
named two of the chapters, but there's all the chapters actually are like in alignment with the way that I operate with my people. So where can
Oh,
people find this book?
wonderful. Yeah, so, if you're in the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, you can get the book wherever books are sold. I mean, Amazon, if you're in the US, Barnes& and Noble, your local indie bookstore. I love supporting local bookstores. If you order it from them, they'll bring it in. So, yes, wherever books are sold.
Thank you. And for people listening, there I have an Amazon link with recommended books, and this book is in there. Um, Thank you so much for your transparency in the book and on the podcast, and your willingness to come on. And I'm grateful for you. Like, the more people like you and I that are in the world, I think it really like helps. Sometimes, when the pandemic happened, I felt like, wow, there's so many people suffering. And so every time I meet people like you, I get really inspired because I know there's other people doing the work, and I'm just really grateful for you.
Oh, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation, and
Yay!
I am grateful for you, and I'm grateful for it. It was so lovely chatting with you.